everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we're continuing our deep dive into Napoleon's most implacable foe, the Austrian Empire, by taking a look at the cavalry. Now, as I said in the infantry videos, if I say Austrian, then I'm going to mean Austro-Hungarian, and if I say German, then I'm going to mean not Hungarian, basically. Obviously Hungarian's Hungarian, but the German does include things like Poles, Italians, Walloons, other nations that were part of the Austrian Empire that weren't the Hungarians. So I just wanted to get that out of the way, just to clear up any potential confusion later on. Austrian cavalry consisted of 5 distinct types: cuirassiers, dragoons, chevauleger, or light dragoons as they would be known in Britain, hussars, and Uhlans. Now, as with the infantry, there were no formally recognised guard units, but there was a unit we'll talk about later on. They were very, very well trained, being excellent horsemen and swordsmen, and perhaps even more importantly, they had some of the best horses in Europe, second only to perhaps the British cavalry, who were mounted largely, well, the heavy cavalry and the guard were mounted on Irish horses, which were particularly good. And they also had some of the best made equipment in the world. According to the article we looked at in the infantry video, The Armies of Europe, which was written in 1855, they said, quote, "The Austrian cavalry is excellent. The heavy or German cavalry, consisting of Germans and Bohemians, is well horsed, well armed, and always efficient. The light cavalry has perhaps lost by mixing up the German Chevauleger with the Polish lancers, but its Hungarian hussars will always remain the models of all light cavalry." End quote. The French cavalry officer de Brac said that the Hungarian hussars were some of the best cavalry in Europe, while Sir John Wilson wrote about the Austrian cavalry, both their cuirassiers and hussars are superb. So we'll start off with the light cavalry, we'll work our way up to the heavies, and first up we'll start with the hussars. Now, Hungary was the birthplace of the hussar, with all hussar uniforms being modelled on traditional Hungarian dress. In his Osprey Warrior series book, Hungarian Hussars 1756 to 1815, David Hollins writes, quote, "Most Hungarians learn to ride in childhood, and went out riding soon acquired with a natural sense of direction, making them the ideal recruits for light cavalry duties." End quote. The word hussar derives from the Latin word for raider, and originally referred to the marauders of the northern Balkans. However, it was adopted by the Magyar people of the Hungarian steppe as the name for irregular light cavalry. The first regiment, the 9th Nad Asti, were formed in 1688, and by 1756, with the formation of the Kaiser Hussars and the regularization of a Yagzia Kumania unit, in that year, of the 7 Years' War, there were 12 regiments. The wild irregulars of the early 1700s were steadily turned into regular army units and undertook the roles expected of light cavalry, scouting, providing pickets, accompanying messengers, etc. While maintaining their reputation for swift movement and unexpected appearances, they became more effective on the battlefield. In a period where shock action by particularly light cavalry was very unusual, 6 regiments massed for a decisive charge during the first defeat inflicted on Frederick the Great at Kolin. 4 months later in October, Andreas Haddick raided Berlin and even sat on Frederick the Great's throne. I was in Berlin recently and saw Frederick the Great's uniform. He was not a tall man, but that's a nice little anecdote that I quite enjoyed there. Recruitment for the Hussars was on a volunteer basis, and there was absolutely no shortage of recruits. There were so many that they could afford to be selective, and it was said that the biggest shame for a Hungarian was to be required as an infantryman. Although Hussars were usually quite small men, the larger ones could console themselves that they could find their way into the elite-ish Hungarian Grenadiers. They chose their men on fitness, ability, but also social class, spanning gypsies and members of so-called dishonourable professions, which includes horse butchers, randomly. So there you go. It's not just the French who obviously like eating horse. The recruits were not to be less than 18, nor more than 30 years old, and grey hair was considered an automatic fail. Preferably, they would be over 5 foot 4 inches tall. Western volunteers, especially the better educated southern Germans, were welcome. So it wasn't that it was you could only do it if you were ethnically Hungarian, but those southern Germans would be expected to keep up with the Hungarian recruits. And if you're born in the saddle, effectively, it's going to be difficult. Although I imagine there was a lot of crossover between southern Germans and Hungarians. They were probably although they spoke German and they were classed as German, they probably were closer to Hungarians than Germans anyway. Due to their fantastic dress and their effectiveness in the defeat of Frederick, the Hungarian hussars became so popular, almost all other European armies formed their own regiments, including France, Russia, Poland, Sweden, Italy, Spain, and Great Britain. As with all hussars, they were very brightly coloured, and being considered one of the hot-blooded people, Hungarians were seen as being more dashing than the stolid, rather boring German counterparts. They carried a curved sabre, which was just under a metre long with an iron scabbard. They also had a carbine, which weighed 2.45 kilograms, with a disproportionately large butt. Now that's going to help you for firing on horseback, because it's going to mean that you can aim down a little bit easier. I'm sure there's some Americans out there who know far more about this kind of thing than I do. But it also does add to the weight. Remember, these will all be wooden stocks. So my normal caveat applies. I'm sure a lot of these got damaged, in inverted commas, or lost along the way. A short ramrod was carried on the cartridge box, which was carried on the crossbelt, and it was also used for pistols as well, which hussars would usually have a brace of. Each squadron also had 6 designated sharpshooters, and they were equipped with rifles. Inordinately heavy, they would be later replaced by a 1789 pattern that was modelled on the Prussian design. The 1798 regulations allowed the Hungarian hussars to wear grey overalls with buttons for campaign, with leather protecting the sabre side of the trousers. The standard boots were cut in the national style, with strong decorations on top. So that's they're quite short. They sort of end halfway up the calf, and they've got a V cut out the front, with the decoration would be a tassel and a coloured rim round the top, usually white, to be fair. The 1911 pattern reintroduced the yellow/black edging, which was twisted to form a simple rosette on the top front. For service in the field, a tall plume was replaced by a pom-pom, and the pelisse was usually worn over the dolman, a greatcoat strapped across the pommel. The lambskin over the saddle was generally black, although I have heard that it was white for parade. So, take that as you will. One of the things that I really like about the hussars' uniform in the Austrian army is they also had coloured shakos. You'll see from the pictures I'll put up, I've painted a regiment with blue shakos, and I just think it makes a really nice change from the usual boring black ones that pretty much everyone else wears. So as we said, at the end of the 7 Years' War, going to the start of the Revolutionary Wars, Austria had 12 hussar regiments. 8 of them were formed in Hungary, 2 in Transylvania, and 2 were from modern Slovakia. These regiments, as was usually the case with Austrians, were absolutely huge. 1,481 men was full strength for a hussar regiment. And while, I said they can be selective, these numbers wouldn't be attained very often, but you'd normally get over 1,000 because there was seen to be so much national prestige. It wouldn't be hard to get those recruits. All right, you wouldn't get up to full strength, but 1,400, I think there's easily every chance that there'd be over 1,000 men. Now, in Black Powder, this would clearly be a large unit. You're looking around about 50 figures, but Black Powder has rules in place to deal with these humongous cavalry regiments. So we'll discuss them at the end, I think. Now, as we saw in the second infantry video, the Austrian Empire could occasionally make good use of its natural or innate abilities of its subjects. Hungarian hussars were dashing and brave, riding excellent, well brought up horses. This dash and elan, however, came at a price, as they lacked the discipline and organisation of French cavalry, French light cavalry in particular. The Polish lancer that we saw quite a lot from in the infantry videos, Chalapowski, said of one engagement, quote, "The enemy hussars had charged us 3 or 4 times during the engagement. Some of them would break into our ranks, and many passed right through and circled back to regain their lines. And after charge, they ended in complete disorganisation. The French, on the other hand, although they had lost formation after a charge, kept together far more, and every time were quicker to regain order. Although the Hungarians drove home their attacks with determination," he continues, "they were far harder to reform into some sort of order. The French, on the other hand, knew that their own horses lacked the Austrians' speed and endurance, and would launch their attacks from closer range, so retaining tighter formation right to the end of the charge, and regaining it more quickly afterwards. I, too, was wounded on the leg above the ankle by a Hungarian that day, but his sword twisted in his hand, and the wound was not deep. It was quite a blow, and I felt it for many years, however." End quote. Now, that wasn't the first time or last time that Hungarian hussars would best their French opponents. Hollins, in his Hungarian Hussar book, says, quote, "During Bonaparte's advance across Italy in 1796, 30 men from the 8th Hussars launched a surprise raid on the French-held city of Brescia on 30th of June, and quickly chased the guards from the walls. The gates were opened and the rest of the squadron swept in, reaching the town drill square, where the garrison troops were scattered and many taken prisoner. The first Hussars adopted a typically resourceful approach when facing the barricaded gates of Bamberg in August 1796. Ordered by the senior commander to break it, they simply ripped the hinges from the wall and the gates fell in." End quote. So the Hungarian Hussars, or the Austrian Hussars, they were known to be men of quick action, quick decisiveness, quick thinking as well, which is always one of those useful qualities for light troops, because you don't necessarily want them under the eye of officers all the time. They've got to be able to think for themselves. At Austerlitz, they performed quite well. Goetz writes, quote, "General Nostitz then took advantage of the fog and smoke that allowed the French infantry to take the village of Telnitz by surprise, now wheeled into action with 2 squadrons of these hussars. The hussars, having been reduced to the role of spectators and targets for French marksmanship all morning, finally had their opportunity. The 1st Battalion of the 108th French Infantry stood in line. Nostitz directed Mohr's men, the Hessen-Homburg Hussars, into the exposed flank of the French infantry, and they swept through the French ranks, causing them to flee to the security of the village. Once through the 1st Battalion, Mohr wheeled his hussars around and charged the 2nd Battalion, hitting it in the flank as well. Uhllan credited the grenadiers of the 2nd Battalion with blunting the Austrian charge sufficiently to allow most of the French troops of 15th Light and 108th Line in front of Telnitz to escape into the village. Nonetheless, many were cut off and captured." End quote. Later, in the 1809 campaign, they would be roughly handled by Lassalle's Infernal Brigade, but at Wagram, Marshal Massena sent forward his light cavalry, Marilaz's 3rd, 14th, 19th and 23rd Chasseurs, against an Austrian battery, causing the gunners to flee. The Austrian cavalry, the Liechtenstein Hussars and the Kienmayer Hussars counterattacked, putting the French Chasseurs to the rout. The Hussars also recaptured the abandoned Austrian battery. Eventually, Lassalle himself had to send one of his brigades, Bruyère's 13th and 24th Horse Chasseurs, to extricate Mirilaz's Chasseurs. Towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars at Leipzig, an incident occurred described by Rillet of the French 1st Cuirassiers. This is a particularly awesome one. He wrote, quote, "We were in column of regiments. The Premier Carabiniers were in front, and General Sabastini was on the right of the regiment. All at once, a mass of enemy cavalry, mainly Hungarian hussars, rode furiously down on the Carabiniers. 'Bravo!' cried the general, laughing and waving the riding crop, which was the only weapon that he deigned to use. 'This will be charming. Hussars charging horse Carabiniers.' But when the Hungarians were 100 paces away, Carabiniers turned about and fled, leaving behind their brave general. He rode back onto the 2nd Carabiniers, and both regiments hooved away. It was such a disgrace that when, after the battle, a group of Carabiniers entered a farm seeking quarters, the Cuirassiers from the 5th Regiment teased them, 'If you want hospitality, try the Hungarian Hussars.'" I just thought that was a really nice story of the Carabiniers, and by the time of the Battle of Leipzig, these were huge guys in brass breastplates, tall Grecian helmets, the fantastic red plumes on the top, being chased down by some raggedy muffin hussars. I thought that was really good. After 30 years of distinguished service, individual soldiers were granted nobility as a Freiherr, and furthermore, in 1789, the Kaiser of Austria introduced gold and silver bravery medals for army-wide recognition. So they instituted a system of rewarding men and particularly units for good deeds done on the field. The 12 Hussar regiments earned between them 581 of these medals, with the 5th Ott Radetzky regiment alone earning 19 gold and 63 silver medals. Whilst bravery and daring do were expected under the Hussar, lapses were severely punished, with the penalty for falling asleep or being drunk on sentry duty being death. These men whose swagger and bluster disguised a steely performance. And Chalapowski wrote, quote, "I was of the opinion then, as I am still today, that the Austrian light horse is the best trained in this kind of warfare. The Austrians are always the most skilled at placing outposts to guard their army." End quote. As is fitting for all dashing hussars, the Hungarians were not only masters of the battlefield, but also of the boudoir. After being exiled to St. Helena, Marie-Louise did not join her husband. Instead, she had been sent to take the waters at Aix with her aide-de-camp, General Count Nieperg. He was the second colonel-in-chief of the 3rd Ferdinand d'Este Hussars and had lost an eye in battle. With his charming manners and a good singing voice, he had already lured one married woman away from her husband, and after the Emperor's death, Marie-Louise married von Nippberg, a marriage that would lead to 3 children. So I think that's a nice overview of the Hungarian Hussars there. I'm going to leave that there for them. Tales of daring do, both on the battlefield and in the bedroom. So I think that's particularly suitable for the Hussars. I've got some ideas on how Hungarian Hussars in particular can be represented in black powder, but we'll come to those at the end. So the next troop type I want to talk about, the next kind of light cavalry, is the Uhlan, of which Austria had 3 regiments, although a 4th was raised in 1814. Again, as with their light infantry, Austria was way behind the curve. Despite only introducing them into the army in 1812, France had 9 Lancer regiments, including the 2 from the Vistula Legion, and Russia upped their number from 3 to 12. Lancers were clearly the way forward. So you've got from 0 to 9, almost instantly for the French, and even the Russians quadrupled the number of Lancer regiments they had, whereas the Austrians increased them by 25%. I think it goes to show that, especially if you look at 19th century warfare, pretty much everyone had Lancers. Even the British used Lancers quite extensively. They were going to be the cavalry troop choice of the 19th century. Austrians a little slow on the uptake there. Instead, Uhlans were a very Central European type of cavalry, and were only really introduced to the major powers in the Napoleonic Wars, although the Austrians and I think the Prussians had some going into them. They were recruited from Poland and Galician Ukrainians and wore a green uniform, faced red with a tall coloured chapka. They recruited 2 pistols, a curved sabre, and most famously the lance, which sported a black over yellow pennon. Again, each squadron of Uhlans had 16 flankers, although in this case half of them were armed with carbines and half with rifles. And so famous were the Uhlans for carrying their lance, there's a saying in Austria, Uhlans always carry the lance, not only when riding, also when dancing. Despite not having the dash or the elan of the Hussars, the Uhlans were an effective unit on the battlefield. Their most impactful clash came at Wagram in 1809. Our old friend Chalapowski was there, and he said, quote, "The French division of heavy cavalry arrived, with a brigade of carabineers at its head. Soon an Uhlan regiment in 6 squadrons trussed up to within 200 paces of the carabineers and launched a charge at full tilt. It reached the line but could not break it, as the 2nd regiment of carabineers was right behind the 1st, and behind that the rest of the cuirassier division." He continues, "I saw a great many carabineers with lance wounds, but a dozen or so Uhlans had also fallen. The Emperor, learning the Austrian Uhlans were Poles, bade me ask this man if he did not know that the Emperor wished to take Poland from those who had dismembered it, and give it back to us. He answered boldly, 'I do know this, and if our Polish officer had approached our regiment, we would have all followed him. But when we are ordered to charge, we have to get on and do it, so no one can say that Poles are bad fighters.'" End quote. So there's that real sense of martial pride that the Poles had, even though they were fighting for the Austrians, who they were not particularly fans of. It's that question of when you're ordered to charge, you're ordered to charge, and you don't want to let your countrymen down. It's almost like a harking back to the Lancers and the gates of Vienna. In that clip there, they charged the Carabineers, and this was in 1809, so it was before the Carabineers were armoured. But the Uhlans seem to have been a natural predator of heavy cavalry, particularly cuirassiers or those heavy dragoons like the Carabineers. They were being vulnerable to being charged or countercharged by enemy lights. Once you got past the tip of the lance, though, they were almost defenceless. As the character in the absolutely 100% historically accurate documentary Sharp's Waterloo says, that once you get past the point, it's like killing rabbits. Now, the obvious answer to me would be to interlace these Uhlans in with heavier regiments. So you put them in with cuirassiers, the cuirassiers do the initial clash, it all goes crazy, and then the Uhlans go in and countercharge those enemy cuirassiers or heavy dragoons. But that only happened rarely. Nafziger narrates an occasion in northern Italy in 1814 where this happened with mixed results. Quote, on the 8th of February 1814, at Pozzolo, Austrian senior officer Merville urged his cavalry to remain ready for a charge from behind the earthen embankment, when a squadron of Uhlans of the Archduke Charles Uhlan regiment then announced that they were being pursued by French cavalry. As soon as the French came within sight, General Verd's dragoon brigade and 4 squadrons of Archduke Charles's Uhlan regiment were sent forward. In the head of the French force advanced 2 squadrons of the 1st Hussar regiment. The French, instead of countercharging, received the Austrians at a standstill and were routed. The Austrian Savoy Dragoon Regiment then attacked the remaining French cavalry frontally, while the Hohenlohe Dragoon Regiment attacked their flank. French and supporting them Italian Queen's Dragoon regiments were overthrown. The Austrians also captured a horse battery, and the disorder of the cavalry spread to adjacent troops. The French-Italian cavalry brigade was hors de combat for the rest of the battle, and in no condition to deploy to the front again. End quote. Again, as was the case with the Hussars, Uhlan units were massive, with a squadron being about 150 men and 8 squadrons making up a regiment, which was reduced to 6 after 1812. It's more manageable on the tabletop due to the Black Powder special rules, which I said we'll discuss at the end when we've finished the brief look at all these different types of cavalry regiments. I try and reduce the lengths of these videos. This one's going a bit longer. I want to try and get it in at under half an hour. So I'm going to discuss the next regiment. That'll complete all the lights. Then we'll do the heavies in a part 2. So the final one that I want to discuss are the Chevauleger, the light dragoons. Now, I always find light dragoons difficult to analyse or discuss because, as the name suggests, they're a sort of estuary, hinterland between proper dragoons and hussars. They perform the role of light cavalry, scouting, pickets, etc., that the hussars do. They also form part of the advance guard, and they are expected to charge as well. In his book, The Instrument of War, says, quote, the Chevauleger were a kind of cavalry which was new to the Austrians, being light dragoons who could serve alongside the cuirassiers and the conventional dragoons on the battlefield. They were also capable of executing raids and other fast-moving enterprises, and doing outpost duty in difficult country at least as effectively as the hussars, and certainly better than the dragoons. On the 17th of June, the new squadron surprised and defeated the finest of Prussian dragoons, the large regiment of Bayreuth, and captured their silver drums. It would be difficult to imagine a more spectacular demonstration of the value of light dragoons. End quote. And I think, as well as me, I don't think the Austrian High Command really knew what to do with them either. Their uniforms constantly changed from the green of sort of like light troops, Jaegers, Grenzer, that kind of thing, back to white coats, as per the dragoons and the cuirassiers, and then back again. They flip-flopped on those throughout the period. So I don't think you can be categorically wrong, right or wrong, if you paint them white or green. I originally painted mine white, I then repainted them green just to differentiate them on the tabletop, because the equipment that they wear and the horse furniture and stuff like that is basically exactly the same. I think the Perrys might even use the same models for Chevauleger and Dragoons. I'm not 100% sure. That might change with the plastic set as well, but I think that's the case. I mean, for what it's worth, in 1811, the white jackets were worn by the 3rd, 5th and 6th regiments, whilst the 1st, 2nd and 4th wore green. They did, however, all wear the helmets that were similar but not quite the same as the infantry pattern. They were far more like the cavalry pattern that Dragoons wore. And they wore those no matter what colour coat they wore. They didn't change to shakos or anything like that. In 1798, there were 7 Chevauleger regiments, and they were renamed to Light Dragoons, but then a few months later they became Chevauleger or Dragoons back again. So, like I say, there's a lot of flip-flopping with these guys. I think it shows to me that the High Command didn't really know what to do with them, I don't think. In 1801 to 1802, 5 Light Dragoon regiments and a newly formed Dragoon regiment became Chevauleger again, and they stayed that for the rest of the war. And in 1814, a 7th regiment of Chevauleger was formed of Italians, and that added to the 4 existing Bohemian units, so that's the modern-day Czech Republic. Well, it's got a new name now, hasn't it? But Czech Republic, 1 Austrian and 1 Polish regiment of Chevauleger. Unlike British light dragoons, only the flankers had missile weapons, and again, it was 16 per squadron, divided 8 rifles, 8 carbines. And they were equipped far more in the style of heavy dragoons, with sabres, heavy cavalry sabres, rather than the light cavalry sort of curved sabre. I don't think there's really going to be a distinction on how they operate on the tabletop. I think he's right that they operate almost exactly the same. Regiments seem to carry the yellow flag, the Ordinaristandati, but as you can see from the pictures, I gave my Chevauleger the white flag, the Liebenstadt, because the special rules for black powder and Austrian cavalry mean that you're going to have multiple units on the tabletop anyway. So I wouldn't worry too much about it, especially when black powder is concerned, because you're going to either end up with units with no flag at all, or you're going to want to use both. So that's it for the Austrian light cavalry. Join me again next time where we discuss the heavy cavalry. I'm just recording this on my new laptop, so I'm not sure about the sound levels. I'm going to need to mess about with them, but I hope they're not too off. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.